In the autumn of 1847, workmen attempting to repair the foundation of the Grand Sinclair estate in Rappahannock County, Virginia, made a discovery that would forever alter our understanding of one of the most respected families in the region. Beneath the elegantly appointed drawing room where countless community gatherings had taken place, where Sunday dinners brought together the local elite, and where Reverend Ezekiel Sinclair had counseled troubled souls for over 2 decades, lay a charnel house of unimaginable proportions. The workers, initially concerned only with replacing rotted support beams, uncovered what county records would later describe as the remains of no fewer than 37 human beings, their bones bearing unmistakable marks of deliberate dismemberment and careful processing. What the authorities discovered that October day, and what they desperately tried to suppress in the months that followed, represents perhaps the most systematic and calculated series of murders in Virginia's antebellum history. Between the years 1820 and 1845, over 40 people had vanished without explanation in the counties surrounding the Sinclair property. Travelers on the Great Road heading west simply disappeared. Families seeking religious guidance never returned home. Orphan children placed in the care of charitable institutions found their way to the Sinclair household and were never seen again. The official investigation, such as it was, lasted exactly 6 days. The records were sealed by order of the circuit judge, the evidence was destroyed, and the surviving members of the Sinclair family quietly relocated to parts unknown. For over a century and a half, this story remained buried beneath layers of official silence and community shame. But recently uncovered correspondence, including letters between county officials and state authorities, along with testimony from a servant who escaped the estate in 1844, have finally brought this dark chapter into the light. Before we descend deeper into this tale of systematic horror, this story is not for everyone. Only those brave enough to confront the darkest chapters of Virginia's hidden history should continue. If you are ready to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to let these stories remain buried, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you are listening from tonight. Together, we will ensure that the victims of the Sinclair family are finally remembered. The Sinclair estate sat on nearly 800 acres of prime Virginia farmland, strategically positioned along the Great Road that carried thousands of westward-bound travelers each year. The main house, constructed in the Georgian style popular among Virginia's planter class, presented an image of refined respectability that would have impressed any visitor. White columns supported a grand portico, while meticulously maintained gardens surrounded the residence on 3 sides. To anyone approaching from the road, the Sinclair property represented everything admirable about Southern prosperity and Christian virtue. Ezekiel Sinclair had arrived in Rappahannock County in 1818, carrying with him impeccable credentials as a minister of the gospel and letters of recommendation from prominent clergymen in Charleston. At 32 years of age, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that naturally drew people to him. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with penetrating blue eyes and a voice that could fill the largest church without effort, Sinclair quickly established himself as a spiritual leader of unusual charisma and authority. His wife Martha, 10 years his junior, complemented his public persona perfectly. Where Ezekiel commanded attention through force of personality, Martha wielded influence through her reputation for charitable works and her seemingly boundless compassion for those less fortunate. Together, they represented the ideal Christian couple, devoted to serving their community and caring for those who had nowhere else to turn. The couple had purchased their estate using funds that Ezekiel claimed came from a generous inheritance left by his deceased father, a successful merchant in the Carolina Low Country. County records show that the transaction was completed entirely in gold coin, an unusual but not unprecedented method of payment for such a substantial property. Within months of their arrival, the Sinclairs had established themselves not merely as landowners, but as pillars of the local community. Ezekiel immediately began conducting regular services at the small Presbyterian church in town, drawing congregations that soon outgrew the modest building. His sermons, remembered by survivors as both inspiring and unsettling, frequently focused on themes of divine judgment and the necessity of purifying the world of those who had fallen from grace. He spoke often of his calling to serve as an instrument of God's will, to separate the wheat from the chaff in preparation for the coming kingdom. Martha, meanwhile, became known throughout the county for her work with unfortunate souls who found themselves without family or means of support. Travelers who fell ill on the road often found their way to the Sinclair estate, where Martha would nurse them back to health in a specially prepared wing of the house. Orphan children from the county poorhouse frequently spent extended periods under her care, receiving what appeared to be excellent education and moral instruction. The Sinclairs also became known for their generous hospitality toward those making the difficult journey westward. Their estate became an unofficial stopping point for families traveling to the frontier territories, offering clean beds, hot meals, and spiritual counseling to those facing the uncertainties of frontier life. Many travelers wrote grateful letters to friends and family, describing the unexpected kindness they had received from this remarkable Virginia family. What none of these grateful visitors could have known was that their letters would be among the last communications their loved ones would ever receive. The Sinclair estate, for all its outward appearance of Christian charity and Southern hospitality, had become something far more sinister. Behind the elegant facade and beneath the floorboards of that gracious home, a systematic operation was taking shape that would claim dozens of lives over the course of the next quarter century. The first hints that something was amiss began to surface as early as 1821, though at the time, few people connected the isolated incidents into any kind of pattern. A family of German immigrants, last seen accepting the Sinclairs' invitation to rest at their estate, simply failed to continue their journey west. When concerned relatives made inquiries months later, they were told that the family had departed early one morning, apparently having decided to take a different route to avoid winter weather. Similar disappearances occurred with increasing frequency over the following years, but in a time when communication was slow and record-keeping was often haphazard, few people recognized the emerging pattern. The Great Road carried hundreds of travelers each month, and it was not uncommon for families to change their plans, take alternate routes, or simply lose touch with relatives for extended periods. But by 1825, certain members of the local community had begun to notice troubling coincidences. Dr. William Hayes, the county physician, remarked to his wife that he had been consulted by an unusual number of people seeking information about missing relatives who had last been seen in the vicinity of the Sinclair estate. Sheriff Thomas Bradley noted in his personal journal that while crime was generally rare in their peaceful county, the number of missing person reports had increased dramatically since the Sinclairs' arrival. The truth about what was happening at that elegant estate would not emerge for more than 2 decades, and when it finally did, the revelation would shatter the community's faith in everything they thought they knew about their most respected neighbors. The final evidence that sealed the Sinclair family's fate emerged during the winter of 1838, when systematic excavations of the estate grounds revealed the true scope of their murderous enterprise and provided irrefutable physical proof of crimes that spanned nearly 2 decades. The discovery of human remains in locations identified by Ezra's testimony transformed the case from one based primarily on documentary evidence and witness statements into an undeniable catalogue of systematic murder. The excavation process, supervised by Pierce and conducted under the authority of a special judicial commission, uncovered evidence that exceeded even the investigators' worst expectations. Burial sites scattered throughout the estate's 800 acres contained the remains of at least 57 individuals, far more than the 43 victims documented in the family's written records. The additional discoveries suggested that the Sinclairs had eliminated witnesses and accomplices who had outlived their usefulness, expanding their victim count beyond the travelers and vulnerable individuals who had been their primary targets. The physical evidence recovered from these sites provided disturbing insights into the family's methods and the systematic nature of their operation. Many of the remains showed clear signs of violence that contradicted the natural deaths or accidents that official records had claimed. The presence of personal effects buried with the bodies allowed investigators to identify victims whose disappearances had never been officially reported, revealing the full extent of the social invisibility that had made the family's crimes possible. Most significantly, the excavations uncovered evidence of the family's disposal methods that confirmed the most horrific aspects of witness testimony. The discovery of specialized tools and equipment buried near the main processing sites demonstrated that the Sinclairs had developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for eliminating evidence and extracting value from their victims' remains. The family's response to these discoveries marked their complete transition from calculated criminals to desperate fugitives. Faced with overwhelming physical evidence that made denial impossible, Ezekiel and Martha began planning an escape that would take them beyond the reach of Virginia's legal system. Their preparations revealed both the extent of the wealth they had accumulated through their crimes and their complete abandonment of any remaining family members who might slow their flight. Samuel and Jeremiah, abandoned by their parents and facing certain execution if captured, made their own desperate attempt to flee the region. Their flight was complicated by their lack of resources and their unfamiliarity with life beyond the estate that had been their entire world. The psychological damage inflicted by years of participating in systematic murder had left them ill-equipped to function independently in normal society. The manhunt for the fleeing family members became a regional obsession that captured public attention throughout Virginia and neighboring states. Newspaper accounts of the search, filled with sensational details about the crimes and the ongoing investigation, transformed the Sinclair case into a national sensation that highlighted the vulnerability of isolated communities to systematic predation. Pierce's coordination of the search efforts demonstrated both his professional competence and his determination to see justice done for the dozens of victims whose remains had been recovered from the estate. His understanding of the family's psychology and operational methods proved crucial in predicting their likely escape routes and identifying locations where they might seek shelter or assistance. The capture of Samuel and Jeremiah occurred 3 weeks after their attempted escape, when their erratic behavior and obvious desperation attracted the attention of local authorities in a small town near the North Carolina border. Their arrest provided investigators with additional information about the family's crimes and confirmed many of the details that had been revealed through previous testimony and physical evidence. The brothers' psychological condition at the time of their capture revealed the devastating impact that years of systematic murder had inflicted on their mental state. Their rambling confessions, delivered during interrogation sessions conducted by Pierce and local officials, provided disturbing insights into the process by which normal children had been transformed into willing participants in their parents' murderous enterprise. Are you as astounded as we are by the sheer scale of this family's evil and their ability to maintain their operation for so many years? This case demonstrates the importance of questioning authority and refusing to accept comfortable explanations when evidence suggests darker truths. Share this investigation with others who value historical accuracy over sanitized narratives. Hit that like button to support our efforts to expose suppressed history, and subscribe to ensure you never miss these carefully researched examinations of America's hidden horrors. The final phase of the investigation focused on locating Ezekiel and Martha, whose escape had been more carefully planned and better funded than their son's desperate flight. Intelligence gathered from their former accomplices suggested that the couple had access to substantial financial resources and had established contingency plans for exactly this type of emergency. The search for the elder Sinclairs would test the limits of 19th-century law enforcement capabilities and reveal the extent of the network that had enabled their crimes. Their ultimate fate would determine whether the full scope of their operation would ever be completely understood or whether some secrets would die with them. The psychological impact of the revelations about the Sinclair family extended far beyond their immediate community, raising disturbing questions about the ability of respected institutions to protect society from systematic predation. The case had exposed not just individual criminals, but the broader failures of oversight and accountability that had allowed their crimes to continue undetected for so many years. The pursuit of justice for the Sinclair family's crimes extended far beyond the capture of Samuel and Jeremiah, as investigators worked to unravel the complete network of corruption and complicity that had enabled nearly 2 decades of systematic murder. The broader implications of the case began to emerge as authorities in multiple states discovered connections between the Sinclairs and unsolved disappearances that had occurred throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. Pierce's expanded investigation revealed that the family's operation had been far more extensive than initially understood, with evidence suggesting that they had conducted similar activities in other locations before establishing their base in Rappahannock County. Financial records recovered from their estate showed payments to individuals in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas, suggesting a network of accomplices that spanned multiple jurisdictions and had been operating for potentially decades. The systematic examination of missing person reports from neighboring states uncovered patterns that bore striking similarities to the Virginia cases. Travelers who had disappeared along major transportation routes, vulnerable individuals who had vanished while seeking charitable assistance, and suspicious deaths of people who had raised questions about respected community figures all suggested that the Sinclair model had been replicated or inspired similar operations elsewhere. The legal proceedings against the captured family members became a showcase for the emerging field of criminal investigation, as Pierce's methodical approach to evidence gathering and case construction set new standards for how complex criminal conspiracies could be prosecuted. The trial proceedings, conducted under intense public scrutiny, provided a comprehensive examination of the family's methods and revealed the full scope of institutional failures that had enabled their crimes. Samuel Sinclair's testimony during his trial provided the most detailed account of the family's operational evolution and the psychological processes that had transformed ordinary family relationships into partnerships in systematic murder. His description of how children raised within the operation had been gradually indoctrinated into accepting violence as normal revealed disturbing insights into the intergenerational transmission of criminal behavior. Jeremiah's psychological breakdown during his trial proceedings prevented him from providing coherent testimony, but his condition itself served as powerful evidence of the psychological damage inflicted by years of participation in systematic killing. Medical experts who examined him described symptoms that would not be formally recognized as post-traumatic stress for many decades, but which clearly resulted from prolonged exposure to extreme violence. The trials also provided a forum for victims' families to finally learn the truth about their loved ones' fates and to seek some measure of justice for crimes that had gone unpunished for so many years. The emotional testimony from relatives who had spent years wondering about missing family members added a human dimension to proceedings that might otherwise have focused solely on legal technicalities. The execution of Samuel and Jeremiah Sinclair in the spring of 1839 marked the first concrete punishment for crimes that had claimed dozens of lives over nearly 2 decades. However, the absence of the elder Sinclairs from these proceedings left many questions unanswered and prevented the complete resolution that the victims' families deserved. The manhunt for Ezekiel and Martha had evolved into an international effort as evidence emerged suggesting that they had fled the country using false identities and resources accumulated through their criminal activities. Reports of sightings came from locations as distant as Canada, Mexico, and even Europe, though none could be definitively confirmed through the limited investigative capabilities available in the 1830s. The failure to capture the elder Sinclairs became a source of ongoing frustration for Pierce and other investigators who understood that the masterminds of the operation had escaped accountability for their crimes. Their continued freedom also meant that crucial information about the full scope of their activities and the identities of additional victims would likely never be recovered. The investigation into the Sinclair network ultimately exposed corruption and complicity that extended far beyond Rappahannock County. Officials in multiple jurisdictions were removed from office, medical professionals lost their licenses, and business leaders faced criminal charges for their roles in enabling or concealing the family's activities. The broader implications of the case extended beyond individual prosecutions to fundamental questions about how communities could protect themselves from systematic predation by individuals who used respected positions and charitable facades to conceal criminal activities. The Sinclair case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unquestioned authority and the importance of maintaining vigilance even towards seemingly virtuous community leaders. The reforms implemented in response to the case included new requirements for documenting and investigating missing person reports, improved coordination between jurisdictions in tracking criminal activities, and enhanced oversight of charitable institutions that served vulnerable populations. These changes, while imperfect, represented significant improvements in the protective capabilities of law enforcement and social service agencies. The psychological impact of the revelations continued to reverberate throughout the region for years after the trials concluded. Communities that had once prided themselves on their ability to identify and support virtuous leaders found themselves questioning their judgment and examining their institutions with new skepticism. The Sinclair case also contributed to broader national conversations about the nature of evil and the capacity of ordinary-seeming individuals to commit extraordinary crimes. The systematic nature of their operation challenged comfortable assumptions about criminal behavior and forced society to confront the possibility that monsters could hide behind facades of respectability for extended periods without detection. The incomplete resolution of the case, with two of the primary perpetrators remaining at large, served as a permanent reminder of the limitations of justice and the possibility that other similar operations might be continuing undetected in communities throughout the nation. The final chapter of the Sinclair family's story extends far beyond their immediate crimes to encompass the lasting impact their actions had on American society's understanding of institutional vulnerability and the capacity for evil to hide behind facades of respectability. The case became a watershed moment that fundamentally altered how communities approached the evaluation of charitable institutions and religious authority figures who claimed to serve society's most vulnerable members. In the immediate aftermath of the trials and executions, the Sinclair estate was sold to satisfy claims from victims' families and to fund the ongoing investigation into their network of accomplices. The property itself became a source of morbid fascination for visitors who traveled from distant states to see the location where such systematic horror had been concealed for so many years. The basement chambers where victims had been held and processed were eventually sealed and filled with concrete, though local legend maintains that the screams of the dead can still be heard on quiet nights. The fate of Ezekiel and Martha Sinclair remained a mystery that continued to generate speculation and alleged sightings for decades after their escape. Some accounts placed them in South America, where they supposedly continued their criminal activities under new identities. Others suggested that they had been murdered by former accomplices who feared exposure. The most credible reports indicated that they had died in a yellow fever epidemic that swept through New Orleans in 1841, though their bodies were never officially identified. Ezra Sinclair, whose cooperation with investigators had been crucial in exposing the family's crimes, spent the remainder of his life attempting to atone for his participation in their operation. He became a traveling preacher who dedicated himself to warning communities about the dangers of unquestioned authority and the importance of protecting vulnerable individuals from exploitation. His sermons, delivered throughout the frontier territories, provided detailed accounts of how systematic evil could operate behind facades of Christian charity. The investigative methods pioneered by Jonathan Pierce during the Sinclair case became a model for criminal investigation that influenced law enforcement practices throughout the United States. His systematic approach to evidence gathering, witness protection, and interjurisdictional cooperation established principles that remained relevant well into the 20th century. Pierce himself continued his investigative career, specializing in cases involving institutional corruption and systematic criminal enterprises. The broader impact of the Sinclair revelations extended to fundamental changes in how American society approached charitable work and religious authority. The case demonstrated that good intentions and pious rhetoric could conceal the most horrific crimes, leading to new emphasis on accountability and oversight for institutions that served vulnerable populations. These reforms, while imperfect, represented significant improvements in the protective capabilities of social service agencies. The legal precedents established during the Sinclair trials influenced criminal law development for generations, particularly in areas relating to conspiracy prosecutions and the handling of systematic criminal enterprises. The case demonstrated that criminal organizations could operate for extended periods within seemingly respectable communities, requiring new approaches to investigation and prosecution that could address complex networks of complicity and corruption. The psychological legacy of the Sinclair case contributed to broader national conversations about the nature of evil and the capacity of ordinary individuals to participate in extraordinary crimes. The systematic nature of their operation challenged comfortable assumptions about criminal behavior and forced American society to confront the possibility that monsters could hide in plain sight for extended periods without detection. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerability of marginalized populations to systematic exploitation and the importance of creating protective mechanisms for people who lacked strong social connections or advocates. The Sinclairs had deliberately targeted individuals whose disappearances were unlikely to generate intensive investigations, revealing gaps in social protection that required systematic reform. The historical documentation of the Sinclair case, preserved in court records and investigative files, provided future researchers with unprecedented insights into the operational methods of systematic criminals and the institutional failures that enabled their activities. These records became valuable resources for understanding how criminal enterprises develop and maintain themselves within legitimate communities. The story of the Sinclair family serves as a permanent reminder that evil can assume many forms and that societies must maintain constant vigilance against those who would exploit positions of trust and authority for criminal purposes. Their crimes demonstrate the importance of questioning comfortable narratives and maintaining skepticism toward authority figures who claim special moral insight or divine approval for their actions. What lessons do you take from this chilling investigation into one of America's most systematic criminal families? The Sinclair case reminds us that we must never stop questioning authority and examining the institutions we trust to protect our most vulnerable citizens. Share your thoughts in the comments below about how communities can better protect themselves from predators who hide behind facades of respectability. If you found this deep dive into suppressed American history as disturbing and enlightening as we did, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to ensure you never miss our investigations into the dark corners that powerful people prefer to keep hidden. The Sinclair family's legacy ultimately serves as both a warning about the capacity for evil to flourish when accountability fails and a testament to the power of determined investigation to expose even the most carefully concealed crimes. Their story reminds us that justice, while sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail when communities refuse to accept comfortable lies in place of difficult truths. The victims of their crimes, finally remembered and honored through the exposure of their killers, stand as eternal reminders of the price society pays when it fails to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The deeper one examines the Sinclair family's integration into Virginia society, the more disturbing their carefully constructed facade becomes. Ezekiel's background, which he claimed traced back to distinguished Scottish Presbyterian ministers, appears to have been largely fabricated. Recent research into Charleston church records reveals no trace of the prominent Sinclair family he described, nor any record of the substantial inheritance that supposedly funded their Virginia estate purchase. What investigators did discover, buried in the archives of a disbanded Charleston asylum, was a record of one Ezekiel Murdoch, committed in 1815 for what physicians of the era termed religious mania and violent delusions of divine appointment. The patient, matching Sinclair's physical description exactly, had escaped custody during a transfer in early 1817, vanishing without trace until a man calling himself Ezekiel Sinclair appeared in Virginia the following year. Martha's origins proved equally mysterious. While she claimed to be the daughter of a respectable Georgia plantation family, no records exist of her birth, education, or family connections. What does exist, however, is documentation of a Martha Blackwood, wanted in connection with the deaths of 3 elderly patients at a private nursing establishment in Savannah. The woman had disappeared in 1818, taking with her not only substantial funds but also detailed medical knowledge about poisons and their effects. The couple's transformation from whatever they had been before into the pillars of Rappahannock County society represents a masterpiece of calculated deception. They understood instinctively that rural Virginia communities valued religious authority, charitable works, and social respectability above all else. By positioning themselves as devout Christians dedicated to helping the less fortunate, they gained not only acceptance but active protection from a community eager to believe in their goodness. Ezekiel's sermons, when examined through the lens of what we now know, take on deeply sinister undertones. Survivors recalled his frequent references to divine judgment and the necessity of purging the world of the unworthy. He spoke often of being chosen as God's instrument to separate the righteous from the wicked, themes that his congregation interpreted as inspiring calls to moral living but which likely reflected his actual activities. His theological approach emphasized the concept of hidden sin and the importance of absolute trust in spiritual authority. Parishioners remember him declaring that some souls were so corrupted that only death could cleanse them, and that God sometimes called upon his servants to act as agents of the divine justice. These ideas, presented within the context of traditional Christian doctrine, prepared his community to accept that some people simply disappeared because God had called them home. Martha's charitable reputation provided the perfect complement to her husband's spiritual authority. Her work with the sick, the orphaned, and the destitute gave the family access to society's most vulnerable members while simultaneously establishing her as a woman of extraordinary compassion. County records show that she served on committees overseeing the poorhouse, the orphanage, and the county hospital, positions that allowed her to identify potential victims and arrange for their transfer to Sinclair care. The couple's hospitality toward travelers created an additional stream of victims while reinforcing their reputation for Christian charity. The Great Road carried a constant flow of families heading west, many of them carrying their life savings and possessions in easily transportable form. These travelers, often exhausted and grateful for kindness, represented ideal targets for the Sinclairs' operations. By 1822, the estate had become known throughout the region as a place where the unfortunate could find help and where travelers could rest safely. This reputation was carefully cultivated through strategic acts of genuine charity performed in full view of the community, creating witnesses who would later defend the family against any suspicion. The Sinclairs also cultivated relationships with local officials, ensuring that any investigations into disappearances would be handled with minimal scrutiny. Sheriff Bradley, despite his private concerns, found himself reluctant to pursue inquiries too aggressively when they involved such respected community members. Judge Harrison, who regularly dined at the Sinclair table, dismissed reports of missing persons as typical frontier hazards. If you're finding these revelations as chilling as we are, you're not alone in recognizing how masterfully this family manipulated an entire community. Share this video with friends who appreciate true crime stories that reveal the darkest aspects of American history. Hit that like button if you want to see more investigations into suppressed historical cases, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these carefully researched stories that others tried to bury forever. Behind this facade of respectability, the Sinclairs were developing the operational methods that would soon claim dozens of lives. The operational methods that the Sinclairs developed during their early years in Virginia reveal a level of systematic planning that transforms isolated murders into something approaching industrial-scale killing. By 1823, what had begun as opportunistic crimes had evolved into a carefully orchestrated system designed to identify, isolate, and eliminate victims while maintaining the family's reputation for Christian charity. The process typically began with Martha's charitable work or Ezekiel's pastoral duties. Through her positions on various county committees, Martha gained access to detailed information about the most vulnerable members of society. Orphan children, elderly residents without family connections, and immigrants struggling with language barriers all became potential targets for what the family euphemistically called their special ministry. Ezekiel's role as a spiritual counselor provided additional opportunities to identify suitable victims. People seeking religious guidance often revealed intimate details about their personal circumstances, their family connections, and their future plans. Those who mentioned being estranged from relatives or traveling without companions found themselves receiving particularly intensive pastoral attention. The estate itself had been systematically modified to accommodate the family's activities. The basement, originally designed for food storage and basic household functions, had been expanded and divided into separate chambers. One section served as a holding area where victims could be kept while their fate was decided. Another had been converted into what can only be described as a processing facility, equipped with tools and implements that served purposes far removed from legitimate household activities. The most disturbing aspect of the Sinclairs' methodology was their patience. Unlike criminals who acted impulsively, they invested weeks or even months in each victim, building trust and creating plausible explanations for eventual disappearances. A sick traveler might be nursed back to health over several weeks, during which time the family gathered detailed information about the person's background, destination, and expected arrival time at their final destination. Children presented particular opportunities for the family's operations. Orphans placed in Sinclair care were gradually isolated from any remaining community connections. Their education, which initially impressed county officials, served the dual purpose of making them useful to the household while ensuring their complete dependence on the family. These children often spent months or even years at the estate before their ultimate fate was decided. The family's first confirmed victim was likely a German immigrant named Klaus Zimmermann, who arrived at the estate in November 1822 seeking medical attention for his pregnant wife. County records show that Zimmermann had been traveling with a substantial sum of money intended to purchase farmland in Ohio. He and his wife were last seen accepting the Sinclairs' invitation to stay until the baby was born and the mother had recovered sufficiently to continue traveling. When spring arrived and the family failed to resume their journey, concerned neighbors made discreet inquiries. Martha explained that complications during childbirth had claimed both mother and child, and that the grieving father had decided to return to Germany rather than continue west. She produced a letter, supposedly written by Zimmermann, thanking the family for their kindness and explaining his decision to sail home from Norfolk. The letter, examined by modern handwriting experts, was almost certainly forged. More significantly, no records exist of any German immigrant matching Zimmermann's description booking passage from Norfolk during the relevant time period. What investigators did find, decades later, were personal items belonging to the family buried in a section of the estate grounds that Martha had claimed as her herb garden. The success of this first operation established patterns that the family would follow for years to come. They learned the importance of creating plausible explanations for disappearances, the value of forged correspondence in deflecting suspicion, and the necessity of completely disposing of evidence that might connect them to missing persons. By 1824, the Sinclairs had refined their methods to the point where they could handle multiple victims simultaneously without arousing suspicion. The estate's reputation for charitable work provided perfect cover for the constant stream of unfortunate souls who arrived seeking help and were never seen again. The family's growing confidence in their operations coincided with an expansion of their activities. What had initially been opportunistic crimes targeting individual victims evolved into a more systematic approach that treated murder as a business enterprise. They began actively seeking out potential victims rather than simply waiting for opportunities to present themselves. Ezekiel started making regular trips to neighboring counties, ostensibly to conduct revival meetings and offer spiritual guidance to isolated communities. These journeys served the dual purpose of identifying potential victims and establishing alibis for times when people disappeared from the estate. His charismatic preaching attracted followers who often expressed interest in visiting the family's estate for extended spiritual instruction. Martha's charitable work expanded beyond Rappahannock County as word of her compassion spread throughout the region. She began accepting requests to care for difficult cases that other communities could not handle, arrangements that brought a steady stream of victims directly to the estate while reinforcing her reputation as a woman of extraordinary Christian virtue. The operational sophistication they achieved during this period reveals minds that approached murder with the same systematic planning that successful merchants applied to their businesses. Every aspect of their activities was designed to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities to continue their deadly work. By 1825, the Sinclairs had transformed their murderous activities into what can only be described as a systematic enterprise with clearly defined victim selection criteria and increasingly sophisticated disposal methods. The random opportunism of their early crimes had given way to calculated targeting based on specific characteristics that minimized risk while maximizing both profit and the likelihood that disappearances would go unnoticed. Their preferred victims fell into distinct categories, each selected for particular advantages they offered to the operation. Westward travelers represented the most valuable targets, often carrying their entire life savings in easily portable form and having severed most ties with their communities of origin. These families typically planned to disappear from their former lives anyway, making their actual disappearance less likely to trigger immediate investigations. Religious pilgrims seeking Ezekiel's spiritual guidance provided another steady stream of victims. These individuals often came to the estate specifically to isolate themselves from worldly concerns, making their extended absence from normal social circles appear intentional rather than suspicious. Many had already informed friends and family that they would be unavailable for extended periods while pursuing spiritual development. Orphan children and elderly individuals without close family connections represented the safest targets from an investigative standpoint. The county's poorhouse regularly transferred difficult cases to the Sinclair estate, where Martha's reputation for compassionate care ensured that these placements were viewed as charitable acts rather than potential dangers to the individuals involved. The family had also identified certain types of immigrants as particularly suitable victims. Recent arrivals who spoke limited English, had few established social connections, and carried substantial resources for starting new lives in America often found themselves receiving special attention from the family's charitable outreach efforts. Their unfamiliarity with local customs and their gratitude for any assistance made them exceptionally vulnerable to manipulation. The methodology for processing victims had evolved considerably from the crude improvisation of the early cases. The estate's basement now contained specialized areas designed for different aspects of the operation. One chamber served as a holding area where victims could be kept comfortable while their situations were assessed and plans were finalized. Another section had been converted into what Martha privately called her medical facility, equipped with tools and supplies that served purposes far removed from legitimate healing. The family had also developed sophisticated methods for extracting maximum value from each victim. Personal belongings were carefully catalogued and either sold through intermediaries in distant cities or retained for future use in creating false identities. Valuable items like jewelry, weapons, and tools found ready markets among contacts the family had cultivated throughout Virginia and neighboring states. Financial assets required more careful handling. Large sums of money or valuable documents could not simply disappear without potentially triggering investigations. The Sinclairs developed a network of corrupt officials and dishonest merchants who could help legitimize the transfer of assets through forged documents and false transactions. Bank drafts could be altered, property deeds could be modified, and inheritance documents could be created to support whatever story best served their purposes. The disposal of human remains had become increasingly systematic and thorough. The estate's extensive grounds provided numerous options for concealment, but the family had learned that simply burying bodies was insufficient for long-term security. Martha's medical knowledge, likely acquired during her previous activities in Georgia, enabled her to process remains in ways that eliminated most physical evidence while making identification virtually impossible. The family's operational security extended beyond the physical aspects of their crimes to include sophisticated methods for managing information and controlling narratives. They maintained detailed records of their activities, not for sentimental purposes but as a practical necessity for keeping track of cover stories, maintaining consistency in their explanations, and avoiding contradictions that might arouse suspicion. Ezekiel had developed particular expertise in creating believable documentation to support their various deceptions. His religious education provided him with excellent penmanship and familiarity with formal language, skills that proved invaluable in forging letters, certificates, and other documents needed to explain disappearances. He could produce correspondence that appeared to come from victims themselves, explaining their decisions to change travel plans, return to distant relatives, or pursue opportunities in other regions. Martha's role in managing the practical aspects of victim processing had expanded to include sophisticated planning for each case. She maintained what amounted to a business ledger, tracking the resources invested in each victim against the returns generated through various forms of exploitation. This clinical approach to murder reveals a mind that had completely separated the emotional reality of killing from the practical considerations of profit and security. The couple had also begun involving other family members in their operations. Their eldest son, now approaching his 15th birthday, had been gradually introduced to certain aspects of the family business under the guise of learning responsibility and developing Christian character. The boy's education in these matters was carefully managed to ensure his loyalty while avoiding psychological damage that might interfere with his usefulness. By late 1825, the Sinclairs had achieved a level of operational sophistication that allowed them to handle multiple victims simultaneously while maintaining their reputation as pillars of Christian virtue in their community. Their systematic approach had transformed murder from a risky criminal activity into what they viewed as a sustainable business enterprise that could continue indefinitely without detection. The years 1826 through 1830 marked the peak of the Sinclair family's murderous operations, a period when their systematic approach to killing reached industrial efficiency while their network of accomplices and enablers expanded throughout Virginia and into neighboring states. During this time, the estate processed an average of 8 to 10 victims annually, generating substantial wealth while maintaining the facade of Christian charity that protected them from suspicion. The family's operational expansion during this period was facilitated by the recruitment of carefully selected accomplices who could extend their reach beyond Rappahannock County. Ezekiel had identified corrupt officials, dishonest merchants, and morally compromised individuals throughout the region who could be bought, blackmailed, or otherwise persuaded to assist their activities without fully understanding the scope of the operation. Dr. Marcus Webb, the county coroner, proved particularly valuable to their enterprise. Financial difficulties and a gambling addiction made him receptive to the substantial payments the Sinclairs offered in exchange for his cooperation in certifying deaths and managing official records. Webb's medical authority allowed him to create death certificates for individuals who had never actually died of natural causes, providing legal documentation that supported whatever cover stories the family needed. Sheriff Thomas Bradley, despite his private concerns about the increasing number of missing person reports, found himself gradually compromised through a series of seemingly innocent favors and financial arrangements. The Sinclairs made substantial contributions to his re-election campaigns, helped resolve legal difficulties involving his extended family, and provided him with valuable information about criminal activities in neighboring counties. These relationships created obligations that made aggressive investigation of the family's activities professionally and personally costly. The expansion of their operations required increasingly sophisticated logistics and coordination. Martha had established connections with buyers throughout the Mid-Atlantic region who purchased various categories of goods without asking uncomfortable questions about their origins. Valuable personal effects found ready markets in Philadelphia and Baltimore, where urban anonymity made it easy to sell items without establishing clear provenance. The family had also developed relationships with individuals involved in what was euphemistically called the medical trade. Bodies or body parts could be sold to medical schools, private physicians, and researchers who required anatomical specimens for education and experimentation. This market provided both financial returns and a convenient method for disposing of evidence while serving what could be rationalized as legitimate scientific purposes. The estate's reputation as a refuge for the unfortunate continued to attract a steady stream of potential victims, but the family had also begun actively recruiting targets through more aggressive methods. Ezekiel's revival meetings in distant counties now served as hunting expeditions where he identified vulnerable individuals and convinced them to visit the estate for extended spiritual counseling or medical treatment. Martha's charitable reputation had spread sufficiently that she received requests from throughout Virginia and neighboring states to care for difficult cases that local communities could not handle. These arrangements brought victims directly to the estate while providing perfect explanations for their presence and subsequent disappearances. Official transfers of custody made the victims' presence at the estate completely legitimate and their disappearance appear to be the result of natural causes or personal decisions. The family's success during this period was also facilitated by improvements in their physical facilities and operational procedures. The estate's basement had been further expanded and subdivided to accommodate larger numbers of victims while maintaining security and operational efficiency. Specialized chambers served different purposes in the processing sequence, allowing the family to handle multiple cases simultaneously without interference or confusion. If this systematic expansion of murder operations is as disturbing to you as it is to us, you're witnessing how easily respected community figures could hide monstrous activities behind facades of respectability. This story demonstrates why we must never stop questioning official narratives and examining the dark corners that powerful people prefer to keep hidden. Share this investigation with others who value truth over comfortable lies. Hit that like button to support our efforts to expose suppressed history, and subscribe to ensure you never miss these carefully researched revelations that illuminate the darkest chapters of American society. The peak period of their operations coincided with significant changes in the family structure that would ultimately contribute to their downfall. Their 3 sons, now young men, had been gradually integrated into various aspects of the family business. The eldest, Samuel, had developed considerable skill in document forgery and financial manipulation. The middle son, Jeremiah, showed aptitude for the physical aspects of victim processing and remains disposal. The youngest, Ezra, demonstrated talent for the psychological manipulation and trust building that made victims more compliant and cooperative. This expansion of family involvement created both opportunities and vulnerabilities that the parents initially failed to recognize. While additional family members increased their operational capacity and provided backup capabilities for critical functions, it also multiplied the number of people who possessed complete knowledge of their activities. The sons' involvement represented both the culmination of their parents' success and the beginning of the end for their murderous enterprise. The wealth generated during this peak period allowed the family to enhance their community standing through increasingly generous charitable contributions and social activities. They funded the construction of a new church building, established a scholarship fund for deserving young people, and regularly hosted elaborate social gatherings that reinforced their reputation as pillars of Virginia society. This prosperity and social prominence, however, also increased scrutiny of their activities and created expectations that would prove difficult to maintain as their operations grew more complex and harder to conceal. The period from 1831 to 1835 brought the first serious threats to the Sinclair operation, close calls that forced the family to implement increasingly desperate security measures and eliminate witnesses who had begun to piece together the truth about their activities. These years marked a turning point where the family's confidence gave way to paranoia and their carefully controlled operation began showing signs of the internal pressure that would eventually lead to their exposure. The first major crisis emerged when a traveling minister named Reverend David Hartwell arrived at the estate in the spring of 1831, ostensibly seeking spiritual fellowship with Ezekiel but actually conducting a discreet investigation into reports he had received from concerned parishioners in neighboring counties. Hartwell had been contacted by relatives of missing persons who suspected that something sinister was occurring at the supposedly charitable Sinclair estate. Unlike previous visitors, Hartwell possessed both the intelligence and the authority to pose genuine questions about the family's activities. His theological training allowed him to engage Ezekiel in sophisticated religious discussions that revealed inconsistencies in the man's supposed educational background. More dangerously, Hartwell's investigative approach was methodical and thorough, focusing on details that other visitors had overlooked or dismissed. During his 3-week stay at the estate, Hartwell documented observations that would have exposed the family's operation if he had lived to report them. He noted the unusual modifications to the basement areas, the presence of medical equipment and tools that served no apparent legitimate purpose, and the nervous behavior of the household staff who seemed terrified of saying or doing anything that might displease their employers. Most critically, Hartwell discovered evidence of recent excavation in areas of the estate grounds that Martha claimed were being prepared for expanded gardens. His examination of the soil revealed fragments of clothing and personal effects that clearly indicated the presence of buried remains. When he confronted Ezekiel with these discoveries, the family realized that their operation faced its first existential threat. The elimination of Reverend Hartwell required unprecedented planning and coordination, as his disappearance could not be explained through the usual methods that worked with isolated travelers and vulnerable individuals. Hartwell was an established religious figure with extensive connections throughout Virginia's Presbyterian community. His failure to return from his announced visit to the Sinclair estate would certainly trigger investigations that the family's usual protections might not survive. The solution they devised involved creating evidence of a tragic accident that occurred during one of Hartwell's solitary walks around the estate. The family arranged for his body to be discovered in a ravine several miles from the house, apparently having fallen while crossing a treacherous section during a nighttime walk. Dr. Webb's cooperation ensured that the death certificate attributed the fatality to accidental causes, while carefully placed evidence supported the story of an unfortunate mishap. The success of this operation required the active participation of several accomplices and demonstrated both the extent of the family's network and their ability to coordinate complex deceptions. However, it also marked the beginning of a more dangerous phase in their activities, as they had crossed the line from targeting vulnerable individuals to eliminating people whose disappearances would attract serious attention. The Hartwell incident was followed by several other close calls that required increasingly drastic responses. In 1832, a former servant named Mary Clemens, who had worked at the estate during the previous year, began spreading rumors in town about strange activities she had witnessed during her employment. Clemens claimed to have seen unexplained bloodstains, heard screaming from the basement areas, and observed the family disposing of personal belongings that clearly did not belong to them. Initially, the family attempted to discredit Clemens by questioning her mental stability and moral character, a strategy that proved partially successful given her lower social status and previous difficulties with employment. However, when Clemens persisted in her accusations and began providing specific details that corroborated other suspicious reports, the family realized that more direct action was necessary. Clemens was found dead in her boarding house room 3 weeks after she had begun making her accusations public. The official cause of death was determined to be heart failure, though the woman was only 26 years old and had no known history of cardiac problems. The timing of her death, coming so soon after her accusations against such prominent citizens, raised questions among some community members but was generally accepted as an unfortunate coincidence. The elimination of potential witnesses became a recurring necessity as the family's long-term activities created an increasing number of people who possessed dangerous knowledge. Servants who had worked at the estate for extended periods, delivery men who had made regular visits to the property, and even some members of their network who had begun to understand the full scope of the operation found themselves facing permanent solutions to their inconvenient knowledge. These security measures required the family to maintain detailed surveillance of anyone who might pose a threat to their operation. They developed networks of informants who reported on conversations and activities throughout the county, ensuring that they received early warning of potential problems. This intelligence-gathering operation consumed considerable resources and attention but was viewed as essential for maintaining their security. The psychological toll of these activities began to affect the family dynamics in ways that would prove significant for their eventual downfall. The constant vigilance required to maintain their operation created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that extended even to their relationships with each other. Trust became a luxury they could not afford, even within their own household. The sons, now fully involved in the most dangerous aspects of the family business, began showing signs of the stress and moral corruption that characterized their parents. Their integration into the operation had been successful from an operational standpoint, but it had also created potential security vulnerabilities as young men proved less capable than their parents of maintaining the careful balance between public respectability and private horror. By 1836, whispers of suspicion had begun circulating throughout Rappahannock County with increasing frequency and specificity, as community members started connecting isolated incidents into a pattern that pointed directly toward the Sinclair estate. What had once been dismissed as coincidence or misfortune was now being discussed as evidence of something far more sinister occurring behind the facade of Christian charity that had protected the family for nearly 2 decades. The catalyst for this growing awareness was the arrival of investigator Jonathan Pierce, a former federal marshal who had been hired by the families of 3 missing persons to conduct a private investigation into their disappearances. Pierce possessed both the professional skills and the independence necessary to pursue lines of inquiry that local authorities had been reluctant or unable to follow. His methodical approach to gathering evidence would ultimately expose the carefully constructed lies that had concealed the family's activities. Pierce's investigation began with a comprehensive review of missing person reports filed in Rappahannock and surrounding counties over the previous 15 years. His analysis revealed a pattern that local authorities had either failed to recognize or chosen to ignore. An unusually high percentage of disappearances involved individuals who had last been seen in the vicinity of the Sinclair estate or who had expressed intentions to visit the family for various forms of assistance. The investigator's background in federal law enforcement had taught him to look beyond official explanations and examine the consistency of witness statements over time. His interviews with community members revealed numerous discrepancies in the stories that the Sinclair family had used to explain various disappearances. Details that had seemed plausible when considered individually appeared suspicious when examined as part of a larger pattern. Pierce also discovered that several individuals who had attempted to investigate the family's activities had themselves become victims of unexplained accidents or sudden illnesses. The death of Reverend Hartwell, initially accepted as a tragic mishap, took on new significance when viewed alongside the suspicious deaths of Mary Clemens and 2 other individuals who had raised questions about the estate's operations. The investigator's most significant breakthrough came when he located Sarah Mitchell, a former servant who had escaped from the Sinclair estate in 1834 and had been living under an assumed name in Richmond. Mitchell's testimony provided the first detailed account of the family's activities from someone who had witnessed them firsthand and survived to tell the story. According to Mitchell's statement, recorded in Pierce's private notes, the basement areas of the estate contained chambers specifically designed for holding and processing victims. She described seeing multiple individuals confined in these areas over the course of her employment, people who had arrived at the estate seeking help but who were never seen again after being taken to what Martha called the special treatment rooms. Mitchell's account included specific details about the family's operational methods that corroborated Pierce's other evidence. She described the systematic way in which victims' personal belongings were catalogued and prepared for sale, the medical procedures that Martha performed in the basement facilities, and the disposal methods used to eliminate physical evidence of the family's crimes. Most significantly, Mitchell provided information about the family's record-keeping system, which included detailed documentation of their activities hidden in a concealed compartment within Ezekiel's study. These records, if they still existed, would provide definitive proof of the scope and duration of the family's murderous operation. As Pierce's investigation progressed, word of his activities reached the Sinclair family through their network of informants within the community. The family realized that they were facing a threat unlike any they had encountered before, an investigator with both the skills and the determination to expose their operation regardless of their community standing or official protection. The family's response to this threat revealed the extent to which paranoia and desperation had corrupted their decision-making processes. Rather than attempting to discredit Pierce through their usual methods, they began planning his elimination with the same systematic approach they had used for their other victims. However, Pierce's professional background and suspicious nature made him a far more dangerous target than their previous threats. Are you as shocked as we are by the systematic nature of this family's evil and the community's failure to recognize the signs that were hiding in plain sight? This story illustrates why we must always question authority and refuse to accept comfortable lies when evidence points toward darker truths. Share this investigation with others who value historical accuracy over sanitized versions of the past, and subscribe to our channel to ensure you never miss these carefully researched examinations of America's hidden horrors. The beginning of formal investigation marked a turning point in the Sinclair story, as the family's carefully maintained facade began to crumble under professional scrutiny. The isolation and protection that had enabled their crimes for so many years was finally being challenged by someone with the expertise and determination to uncover the truth. Pierce's investigation had also attracted the attention of federal authorities, who were beginning to understand that the disappearances in Rappahannock County might be connected to similar patterns in other regions where the family had conducted business. The scope of potential federal involvement raised the stakes considerably, as the family realized that their local protections would be useless against investigators operating under federal authority. The family's response to these mounting pressures would determine whether they could continue their operation or whether decades of carefully concealed crimes would finally be exposed to the light of justice. The next phase of their story would test every survival skill they had developed during their years of murderous success. The mounting evidence against the Sinclair family reached a critical mass in early 1837 when investigator Jonathan Pierce successfully located and documented the hidden records that Sarah Mitchell had described during her testimony. The discovery of these documents, concealed behind a false panel in Ezekiel's study, provided irrefutable proof of the systematic nature of the family's crimes and revealed the shocking scope of their murderous enterprise. The records, maintained in Ezekiel's meticulous handwriting, documented 43 separate incidents between 1820 and 1836, each entry containing detailed information about the victims, the methods used to lure them to the estate, and the disposition of their remains and personal effects. The clinical precision of these records revealed minds that had completely divorced themselves from the human cost of their actions, treating murder as a business transaction requiring careful documentation for operational efficiency. Each entry in the ledger followed a consistent format that demonstrated the systematic nature of the family's approach. Victim descriptions included age, apparent financial resources, family connections, and the cover story that would be used to explain their disappearance. Processing notes detailed the methods used to extract information, the timeline for elimination, and the specific disposal techniques employed for each case. Most disturbing were the financial calculations that accompanied each entry, showing the profits generated through the sale of personal effects, the liquidation of financial assets, and in some cases, the sale of human remains to medical institutions. These records revealed that the family had generated substantial wealth through their crimes, accumulating resources that far exceeded what could have been earned through legitimate activities in rural Virginia. The discovery of the records coincided with Pierce's successful cultivation of a key witness within the family's own household. Thomas Bradley, Jr. The sheriff's son, who had been working as a stable hand at the estate, had grown increasingly disturbed by activities he had witnessed during his employment. The young man's conscience finally overcame his fear when Pierce approached him with evidence that made continued silence impossible. Bradley's testimony provided crucial details about the family's operational methods and confirmed many of the allegations that had previously been based on circumstantial evidence. He described witnessing the arrival of victims who were never seen leaving the estate, the transport of suspicious bundles to remote areas of the property during nighttime hours, and conversations between family members that clearly indicated their involvement in murderous activities. Most significantly, Bradley was able to guide Pierce to specific locations on the estate grounds where remains had been buried over the years. His information enabled the investigator to begin the systematic excavation that would ultimately provide physical evidence to support the documentary proof contained in the family's records. The family's awareness of Pierce's progress and Bradley's cooperation triggered a desperate response that revealed just how far they were willing to go to protect their operation. Rather than attempting to flee or negotiate, they decided to eliminate both threats through coordinated attacks that would appear to be unrelated accidents. The attempt on Pierce's life was carefully planned to occur during one of his regular visits to examine evidence at locations around the county. The family arranged for what appeared to be a highway robbery, an attack by masked assailants that would explain the investigators' death while eliminating the primary threat to their security. However, Pierce's professional training and suspicious nature had prepared him for such possibilities, and he survived the assault with only minor injuries. The failure of this assassination attempt marked the beginning of the end for the Sinclair operation, as it demonstrated to local authorities that the family was willing to resort to violence to protect themselves from investigation. Sheriff Bradley, despite his previous cooperation with the family, could no longer ignore the evidence when his own son provided testimony that implicated the Sinclairs in attempted murder. The family's paranoia during this period led to increasingly erratic behavior that further undermined their position within the community. Ezekiel's sermons became more extreme and threatening, focusing obsessively on themes of divine vengeance against those who questioned God's chosen servants. Martha's charitable activities ceased almost entirely as she became consumed with monitoring potential threats and planning defensive measures. The sons, previously reliable participants in the family's activities, began showing signs of psychological breakdown under the pressure of the investigation. Samuel's drinking had become noticeable to community members, while Jeremiah exhibited violent outbursts that alarmed even the family's remaining supporters. Ezra, the youngest, had begun making cryptic comments that suggested he might be considering confession as an alternative to the increasingly dangerous path his family was pursuing. The deterioration of family cohesion created additional vulnerabilities that Pierce was quick to exploit. His psychological analysis of the family dynamics identified potential fractures that could be widened through strategic pressure, particularly by offering protection and clemency to family members who were willing to cooperate with the investigation. The investigators' strategy focused on isolating Ezra, whose youth and apparent moral conflicts made him the most likely candidate for cooperation. Pierce's careful approach to the young man, combined with the mounting evidence against the family, created circumstances that would ultimately lead to the breakthrough that sealed the Sinclairs' fate. As 1837 progressed, the family found themselves increasingly isolated within their own community as former supporters began distancing themselves from people who were now clearly under serious criminal investigation. The protective network that had enabled their crimes for so many years was crumbling under the weight of evidence that could no longer be ignored or explained away through their usual methods of deception and intimidation. The confrontation that would ultimately destroy the Sinclair family began in earnest during the autumn of 1837, when investigator Pierce presented his evidence to a specially convened grand jury that included members from 3 surrounding counties to ensure impartiality. The weight of documentation, witness testimony, and physical evidence had reached a point where even the family's most powerful protectors could no longer shield them from formal legal proceedings. The grand jury's review of Pierce's evidence revealed the staggering scope of the Sinclair operation and its devastating impact on the region's population. The 43 documented cases represented only the crimes for which clear evidence existed, but testimony from various witnesses suggested that the actual number of victims was likely much higher. The systematic nature of the killings, documented through the family's own meticulous records, eliminated any possibility that these deaths could be attributed to accident or coincidence. The family's response to the grand jury proceedings demonstrated the complete breakdown of their previous strategic thinking. Rather than attempting to mount a coherent legal defense or negotiate terms that might save some family members from the worst consequences, they retreated into a siege mentality that prioritized immediate survival over long-term planning. Ezekiel's behavior during this period suggested a complete psychological break from reality. His final sermons, delivered to increasingly sparse congregations, focused obsessively on biblical accounts of persecution and divine judgment. He began claiming that the investigation against his family represented a test of faith similar to Job's trials, and that their ultimate vindication would serve as proof of God's protection for his chosen servants. Martha's response was more pragmatic but equally desperate. She began systematically destroying evidence that might implicate the family in additional crimes, burning documents and disposing of physical evidence that had accumulated over their years of operation. However, her efforts were hampered by the fact that much of the most damning evidence was already in Pierce's possession or had been independently corroborated through witness testimony. The most significant development during this period was the decision by Ezra Sinclair, the youngest son, to break ranks with his family and cooperate with the investigation. His choice was motivated partly by moral revulsion at the crimes he had witnessed and partly by Pierce's skillful psychological manipulation that convinced the young man that cooperation represented his only hope for avoiding execution. Ezra's testimony provided investigators with detailed information about the family's operational methods that had previously been based on speculation and circumstantial evidence. He described the systematic process by which victims were selected, lured to the estate, and ultimately eliminated. His account included specific details about the roles played by each family member and the network of accomplices who had enabled their crimes. Most critically, Ezra revealed the locations of additional burial sites that had not been mentioned in the family's written records. His cooperation led to the discovery of remains that had been concealed for over a decade, providing physical evidence that corroborated many of the missing person reports that had been filed but never adequately investigated. The family's attempt to silence Ezra before he could provide further testimony resulted in a violent confrontation that finally shattered any remaining pretense of respectability. Samuel and Jeremiah's attack on their younger brother was witnessed by multiple community members and provided clear evidence of the family's willingness to resort to violence against their own relatives to protect their secrets. The failed assault on Ezra also triggered a broader investigation into the family's network of accomplices and enablers throughout the region. Pierce's systematic examination of the corruption that had protected the Sinclairs revealed a web of complicity that extended far beyond Rappahannock County and implicated officials, merchants, and professional men in multiple jurisdictions. Dr. Marcus Webb's suicide, occurring just hours before he was scheduled to be arrested on charges of falsifying death certificates and disposing of evidence, eliminated one potential source of information about the medical aspects of the family's operation. However, his death also provided powerful confirmation that the charges against the Sinclairs were based on solid evidence rather than speculation or malicious prosecution. Sheriff Thomas Bradley's arrest on charges of obstruction of justice and accepting bribes marked the complete collapse of the local protection that had enabled the family's crimes for so many years. Bradley's cooperation with investigators, motivated by his desire to minimize the consequences for his own family, provided detailed information about the payments and favors he had received in exchange for limiting investigations into suspicious deaths and disappearances. The systematic unraveling of the family's network revealed the extent to which their operation had corrupted local institutions and compromised the safety of the entire region. The investigation exposed not just the specific crimes committed by the Sinclairs, but the broader failure of law enforcement, medical, and religious authorities to protect vulnerable members of society from systematic exploitation. As winter approached in 1837, the Sinclair family found themselves completely isolated and facing overwhelming evidence of their guilt. Their desperate attempts to cover up their crimes had only generated additional charges and eliminated potential sources of support within their former network of accomplices. The final phase of their story would test whether any trace of their previous cunning remained or whether the psychological pressure of exposure would drive them to even more desperate measures that would seal their ultimate fate.